So there's a few different kinds of inquiry that we're going to talk about. Grounded theory is probably the most popular form of qualitative research, and we'll describe a little bit about what that is. The book talks about it as well. There's ethnographic studies, there's narrative studies, and there are case studies. Grounded theory is the process of inductively developing theories from data. So it's the most pure form of that inductive reasoning, where you start with as blank a slate as possible, where you try and wipe away any preconceived notions you have about what the person's experience is going to be, bracket off your own beliefs. Now again, none of this is possible, and all qualitative researchers struggle with this, getting yourself out of the way of understanding the experience. But there's an attempt made to do so. There's an attempt to sort of take what you think the situation is and set it off to the side and let the data come to you and speak to you directly. And that's the process of grounded theory. You start from that assumption of openness to the experience as presented to you, then you break it down into component parts, and then you build a structure out of it. So it's an iterative process of defining and redefining your research question. So you start with some general sense of what you want to know about, and then you let the data change that for you. So if you started with a set of questions where you thought depression was going to be about sadness, and it turns out that the people aren't talking about sadness so much as they're talking about feeling empty. So you might want to put sadness in there, but they want to talk about emptiness. And this whole process of qualitative inquiry from a grounded theory perspective is allowing those voices to push against what you believe and come through as what they want to be. It might help to be a little bit more concrete, since this all sounds sort of pie in the sky, and there's a specific set of procedures that one does in grounded theory. So the first thing you do is you collect the interviews. If you've tape recorded them, you transcribe them, so you put them in written form, and then we use software. Nowadays there's a number of software programs that you can use. In the old days, what I would used to do is I would print them out and I would cut little phrases out. I would cut things that were called meaning units, these sort of chunks of meaning, where somebody says, you know, to me I call my depression a big black dog. So I would cut that out, and then you sort of organize those across all of your people to try and get a sense of what these little chunks of meaning are and how they fit together across the population that or the sample that you have that you're looking at. And then when you see these groups, these themes begin to pop out. So metaphors for depression might involve darkness or emptiness, or maybe people are talking about sadness or loneliness, or whatever the metaphor that they're using to talk about and describe depression, and you would group the different chunks of the statements that people used into different themes, and then those themes become what you talk about. Now, in the process of grounded theory, as I said, it's iterative. So you come up with a set of themes, and then you would go back to the original text and you would read through the text and you would see, do these themes make sense? And so you're constantly going back and forth between your imposition of a structure onto the experience provided by individuals and back to the individual's experience to see if your structure made sense. And you keep doing that, back to the structure, back to the experience, structure, experience. And in doing so, that conversation between you as the investigator and the data, you hope to be faithful to the presentation as was presented, a presentation of the experience as was presented by your participants. Grounded theory is used a lot, and I think most of the qualitative papers that we've given you or that you are going to use for your EBP projects number 2 are going to use some variant of grounded theory, and there's a number of different types of qualitative inquiry that use the basic grounded theory method of having a blank slate, being open to what people say, breaking what they say into chunks, developing themes based on it, and then going back to the data to see if those themes make sense, and sort of continuing that conversation between the investigator and the data. That's the standard standard structure. But other disciplines use very different forms of inquiry. The most common form of inquiry used in anthropology, for example, is ethnography. And ethnography is this direct observation, often through participant observation. Actually, you know, you sort of have this picture, and I have this picture in my head of you know, Margaret Mead or some you know, curly-haired anthropologist going to Borneo or some Pacific island and living with the natives for years on end and sort of figuring out, how do they see the world? How do they think about time? How do they think about the sun? How do they understand child rearing practices? How do they have relationships? What are the gender norms in that society? What these ethnographic forms of research are trying to get at is cultural, structural beliefs or understandings of the world. How do different human organizations change or alter themselves for their environment or experience things? If you read modern anthropology, you know, again, we have some anthropologists in some of the material that we presented to you guys for your worksheet assignment and the qualitative work. For example, there's an article by Tanya Lerman in there, and she's an anthropologist, and she studies her dissertation work was on psychiatrists, so she went and studied the tribe of psychiatrists. But she'll also think about other forms of mental health. So she's also, I think the article that we have is on mentally ill African American women living on the street in Chicago. So she wants to understand how their service use patterns and behaviors are affected by their cultural experience. So ethnography is really about diving into the cultural meaning of things. There's also narrative or life histories or biographies that focus on understanding a particular individual and their trajectory over the lifespan or within a particular period of time. And we use a lot of this. This is very similar to the kinds of clinical interviews that we do, again, with some exceptions for, you know, you're clinically manipulating people in clinical conditions, whereas in research you're really just trying to get their story. But a lot of that involves listening to people talk through their particular experiences, how they understand things, what happened to them during their course of their life. These sort of narrative and life history, life event forms of research are another form of qualitative inquiry. There are a number of differences between quantitative and qualitative methods that result in different perspectives on some of the topics that we've been talking about. So for example, with sampling, I mentioned that randomization or random selection from a population into a sample is the best method of getting a generalizable sample from a population. But in qualitative research, that's not the goal, to produce a generalizable sample. The goal is to understand a set of experiences that are very heterogeneous across a group of people. So lots of people have lots of different experiences, and I want to get a sense of what the shared commonality is, but it's not that I'm trying to get a representative sample from a population. I want to get a group of people that can talk about or share with me in some specific form the kinds of experiences that they have. So if I'm interested in having people write stories of their life and use that as my qualitative data, then I need good writers. If I want to talk to people about what their experience of using mental health services are, I need to find people that can be descriptive about that. Somebody that has really flat affect and only says yes, no, yes, is not going to provide a lot of data for me. So I need somebody that's going to talk to me and describe it. And so my issues in sampling in a qualitative perspective are about getting access to the information in a way that allows me to analyze the data. It's not necessarily about getting a generalizable form of a generalizable sample from a population. Now, I do want to get the people that have had this experience. So if I'm interested in, so for example, experiences of artistic expression, I should probably go to artists. I shouldn't go to people that think art is bunk and have never had a creative experience in their life. Those people aren't going to be very informative about how to describe a creative experience. Likewise, if I want to understand what it's like to have depression or what it's like to be manic, I need to go to people that have had these experiences rather than sort of sampling from the population at large. In quantitative work, I can also get a really clear sense of what my sample size needs to be, because there are specific statistical procedures that I can use to tell me how many people I need to have in order to answer whatever particular question. And while we don't go over those forms of power analysis in this class, they do exist. For qualitative research, there's a different way of knowing when you have reached the optimal number of individuals in your study. And in a qualitative study, 10 to 20 people is a pretty reasonable size. In a quantitative study, that's bare minimum, but in a qualitative study, that's quite a bit. We use this concept in qualitative study called saturation in order to decide when we've reached enough people. The concept of saturation is just makes a lot of intuitive sense for this purpose. The thing that you need to figure out, you're saturated. You're saturated when you start hearing the same things over and over again, and you interview somebody new, they don't tell you anything you haven't heard, and then you interview the next person and they don't tell you anything that you haven't heard. So once you start hearing the same terms used, the same descriptions used, and there's nothing new coming out of your participants, then you are said to have reached a saturated sample where you've gotten the information that's relevant. Now, this is a qualitative assessment, it's not a quantitative assessment, so you never quite know when you reach saturation, but it's one of those things, like you sort of know it when you see it. In many respects, I think quantitative research is easier than qualitative research. In quantitative research, there's a set of rules for all of these things, and I know some people don't like math, and they don't know what these rules are. But once you know the rules, it's not that hard to do a good quantitative study. You sort of have to. It's a cookbook thing. You can sort of follow a set of rules, and you can produce a reasonably good outcome, or at least know whether you've produced a reasonably good outcome. That's not as true in qualitative research. Now, there are certain things that you should do and shouldn't do in qualitative research, but it's much harder to do, I think, a really good qualitative study. I think it takes a lot more time and a lot more in-depth investigation in order to be rigorous in your qualitative study. So here's a few things that I think make a rigorous qualitative study, and you can use this information when appraising the evidence presented in qualitative articles. Prolonged engagement being one of them. People that go and just sort of stop by, say, hi, how you doing, ask a few questions and leave, that's going to produce less understanding and less in-depth understanding than extensive forms of inquiry. So when I was talking earlier about the study where somebody went to Ireland to look at how schizophrenia plays out in different populations there, she spent years there working on her dissertation, talking to people, getting embedded in the village. She knew that village really well. She lived that village for a couple of years. She knew those people in that village. There was a lot of depth to her understanding, and it wasn't just a sort of a brief tourist stop for her. Another concept is thick description, and this is again one of those things you know it when you see it. And this is one of the things I love about Tanya Lerman's work in some of these articles that we've given you for the worksheet project, is she gets into real depth of individuals' understanding of how they or why they were or were not using mental health services, and you get a sense that you're there, that you really are grasping a depth to their understanding, and it's not just skirting the surface saying, oh, I don't like clinicians. It's a really rich, colorful kind of descriptive experience that you get when you read these thickly described experiences. And so you can assess the quality of qualitative research by how much surprises you or how much it points you in directions you wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And for me, the real value of qualitative work is when things come out that you just wouldn't have understood in any way without hearing the voices that are coming from the participants. One thing that I think is important in any form, and I described this a little bit when we talked about grounded theory, is a negative case, what's called a negative case approach. And so you essentially what you do in this process is you argue against yourself. Okay, so I started off with this idea that depression is sadness, but these people are talking about that as if it's emptiness. So then I go back to the data. I was like, are they really saying empty or are they really saying sad? So you try and argue against yourself with the data and your interpretation of the data, really being open to being wrong, and you try and find the places where your structure that you've imposed on these statements doesn't fit. It takes a lot of intellectual integrity. It's very hard for us to think against ourselves. It's not something that we as human beings are predisposed to do, which is why we have all these other scientific methods over here that we've talked about from a quantitative perspective. But in qualitative research, it really takes an honest researcher not to impose their structure onto something, but to be open to what the voices that are being presented by their research participants are telling them. Another way of checking yourself is to use other people and have multiple people code the data. So when talking about grounded theory, I was saying that I was breaking the transcript into small sentences or chunks of sentences that I would then organize by theme. Well, if you had multiple people do that same thing and see where the agreement happened, you could get a sense of what's going on there through the use of these multiple folks or through the use of triangulation, which is another way of thinking about this.